You think you can keep up with men who've actually been to war, sweetheart? This isn't a sorority workout. People get carried off this course on stretchers. Master Sergeant Roy Halverson said it with his arms crossed, a grin spreading under his gray mustache, loud enough for the 11 male candidates behind her to hear every word. Be honest with yourself. Go home. There's no shame in knowing your limits. Have you ever watched a man stake his whole reputation on breaking a woman in front of a crowd, never once suspecting that she'd already done the exact thing he was daring her to fail at in a place he'd only ever read about in briefings? Man, that moment. It sits in my chest even now. This is Cole Uncovers, and I go looking for the stories that powerful people would rather stay buried in a filing cabinet somewhere. So grab a coffee. Put the phone face down for a few minutes, because what this woman is about to do on that training ground in the cold Georgia mud is the kind of thing you tell people about years later and they still don't quite believe you. Danielle Foster grew up in a duplex in Gary, Indiana. The kind of street where half the houses had plywood, where the windows used to be. Her mother, Yvonne, worked 2 jobs and still came to every single one of her track meets, sitting in the bleachers in her work polo because she'd come straight from the second shift. Danielle's father left when she was 4. She didn't remember him, and she'd long since stopped pretending it bothered her. What she remembered was running. She remembered being 12 and running the 4 blocks to the corner store and back just to feel her lungs burn because burning lungs were honest. They didn't lie to you the way people did. She enlisted at 18, not because she had some grand patriotic vision, but because the recruiter was the first adult outside her mother who looked her in the eye and told her she could be more than where she came from. She believed him, and then she spent the next 11 years making him right. By the time this story happens, Danielle Foster was 29 years old. She had 2 combat deployments behind her. She had served 3 years in a special operations support role that most people in this country have never heard of and never will, doing work she still can't talk about at the dinner table. She had been shot at. She had carried a man twice her weight out of a collapsed building with her own collarbone fractured. She held a record in her old unit for a ruck course that still hadn't been broken. And now she was a civilian, 4 months out, trying to build a second life. The thing she decided she wanted was to become an instructor, to teach the next generation of soldiers the things that had kept her alive. To do that, she needed a certification from a private advanced tactical training academy in rural Georgia called Brackenridge. Brackenridge had a reputation. Their certificate opened doors. The selection course was brutal on purpose. 3 weeks of land navigation, combatives, marksmanship, and a final field problem that washed out more than half of everyone who showed up. The man who ran it was Master Sergeant Roy Halverson, retired, 56 years old, 22 years in the Army, and the kind of man who had built his entire identity around being the hardest person in any room he walked into. He had run Brackenridge selection for 9 years. In those 9 years, he had certified exactly 2 women. Both times, he'd made a point of telling people afterward that they'd squeaked by. He didn't think he had a problem with women. He thought he had standards. Danielle showed up on the first morning in a gray t-shirt and a pair of boots she'd broken in over 2 deployments. There were 11 other candidates, all men, most of them younger than her, a few of them ex-military, a couple of them cops looking for a tactical edge. They sized her up in the parking lot the way men always do, quick and quiet, deciding before she'd said a word whether she belonged. Halverson decided out loud. He walked the line on that first morning, clipboard in hand, calling names. When he got to hers, he looked her up and down, then looked at the clipboard, then looked back at her with a small, theatrical frown. Foster, Danielle. He said her first name like it was a curiosity. You list prior service. Support role. He let the word support hang in the air. Logistics, supply, that kind of thing. Among other things, Master Sergeant. Among other things. He smiled at the men. A couple of them chuckled. Well, Danielle, I'll tell you what I tell everybody. This course doesn't care about your feelings, and it doesn't care about your resume. It cares about whether you can keep up. And historically, he tapped the clipboard, people with your background struggle out here, so pace yourself. No shame in tapping out early. Danielle didn't say anything. She'd learned a long time ago that the loudest thing she could do was stay quiet and let her body talk later. That first day was land navigation. 8 points across a forested ridge, compass and map, no GPS. Halverson set a time limit he announced was generous. Danielle came in first, not by a little. She came in 18 minutes ahead of the second-place candidate, a former infantry sergeant named Cody, who was genuinely good and knew it. Halverson looked at her time. He looked at her. Then he wrote something on his clipboard and said, "Loud enough for everyone. Lucky route. The terrain favored the lighter ones today." She'd run that bridge clean. Every point dead on. And the man had decided the dirt did it for her. Cody, the infantry guy, caught up to her at the water station afterward. He was breathing hard, sweat soaking through his shirt. He looked at her sideways. "How'd you clear point 6? I lost 20 minutes in that draw." As a game trail off the saddle, faster than the creep bed. He stared at her for a second. "You've done this before, like the real thing." She just capped her canteen and walked back to the staging area. "Here's a thing you have to understand about a place like Brackenridge, and about a man like Halverson. It wasn't enough for him to run a hard course. He needed to be the reason people failed. He needed the washing out to feel personal, like he'd seen something in you the rest of the world had missed. And the moment a woman showed up and made the first day look easy, something in him locked onto her. She became the thing he had to break to keep the story he told about himself intact. The next morning, he changed the rules. He gathered the candidates and announced that he was adding what he called a leadership stress evaluation. Each candidate would, at a point of his choosing, be pulled out and given an individual challenge in front of the group. Pass it, you continued. Fail it, you were counseled out. It had never been part of the published course. It was, he assured everyone, well within the Academy's discretion. The other candidates grumbled but accepted it. Danielle understood it immediately. The rules now included a door that Halverson could open for her, alone at the worst possible moment, and shove her through. What do you do when the man holding the only certificate you need has already decided that you walking away in tears is the outcome that proves him right? That night, Danielle sat on the edge of her cot in the bunkhouse and called her mother. Yvonne picked up on the second ring the way she always did, like she'd been holding the phone, waiting. "How's Georgia, baby?" "Hot. Buggy. The man running it is a piece of work." There was a pause. Yvonne had raised a daughter who didn't complain, so when Danielle complained, she paid attention. "He giving you trouble because you're a woman or because you're you?" Danielle almost laughed. "Both, I think." Yvonne let that sit. "You remember what I told you when you came home with that broken collarbone and you were so mad you couldn't lift your arm to brush your hair? You said the body heals on its own schedule, and there's nothing I can do to argue it faster." "That's right. Some things you can't rush and you can't argue. You just outlast them. That man wants you to argue. Don't argue, baby. Just outlast him." A pause. "Now go to sleep. You sound tired and you're no good to anybody tired." Danielle lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about every instructor who'd ever underestimated her. Every sergeant who'd handed her the heavy thing assuming she'd buckle. None of them ran her off. She fell asleep before she finished the list. The third day was combatives. Now Danielle had a specific history with hand-to-hand that nobody at Brackenridge knew about, because the people who knew about it had signed the same paperwork she had. In her old role, she trained with men whose names didn't appear on any roster, in techniques designed for the kind of moment where losing meant you didn't come home. She didn't talk about it. She didn't have to. Halverson ran combatives himself on the mats in the metal-roofed barn that served as their indoor space. He demonstrated each drill with a candidate, usually one of the bigger men, throwing them around easily and narrating it like a clinic. He was good. Nobody disputed that. 22 years had made him good. When it came time for live grappling rounds, he paired people up by size. Then he got to Danielle, looked around theatrically, and said, "Now, I don't want anyone hurting Miss Foster, so let's find her somebody gentle." A few laughs. He paired her with the smallest man in the group, a wiry former cop named Reyes, and said, "Take it easy, Reyes. Light contact." Reyes, to his credit, looked embarrassed. Danielle just nodded. They went 3 rounds. She controlled all 3 so completely that by the third, Reyes was laughing through his mouthguard, tapping with something close to relief. The other candidates had stopped their own rounds to watch. Halverson watched too. His jaw was tight. When the round ended, he clapped his hands once, sharp. All right, all right. Reyes was taking it easy, that's the assignment. He turned away. Let's reset. She'd dominated a trained man in front of the entire group, and Halverson had decided it was because the man was being polite. That evening, Reyes found her outside the bunkhouse. He was nursing a sore wrist and looking at her like she was a puzzle. I wasn't taking it easy, he said. I want you to know that. After the first 30 seconds, I was trying everything I had. Where'd you learn that? Around. Around. He shook his head slowly. That guy's got it out for you, you know that, right? He's going to pull that stress eval on you the second you look tired. He's waiting for it. I know. So what are you going to do? Danielle looked out at the tree line, dark against the last of the orange sky. I'm going to keep being better than the excuses he makes for me. Eventually, he runs out of excuses. Bro, can we just sit here a second? A woman who carried a man out of a collapsed building with a cracked collarbone, who's done things in service to this country that you and I will never get clearance to read about. Standing in the Georgia dark, getting told to go home by a man whose biggest danger in 9 years has been a paper cut from his own clipboard. That's not training. That's a man protecting his ego with a whistle and a stopwatch. This is Cole Uncovers, and I promise you the part that's coming is going to feel real good. The middle week of selection was where the course turned cruel. Halverson started singling her out for extra duty. He cited barracks discipline and assigned her the overnight equipment inventory twice in 1 week, work that kept her up until 2 in the morning, counting carabiners and rope by flashlight while the men slept. It wasn't against the rules. It was just designed to grind her down, to take the one thing that wins these courses, recovery, and steal it from her in small, deniable pieces. She did the inventory. Then she got up at 5 and ran the morning PT in front, every time. She started noticing his patterns. Halverson had a tell. When he was about to single someone out, he'd get quiet during the morning brief, set his coffee down, and scan the line slow. She started watching for it the way she'd once watched a tree line for the wrong kind of stillness. She kept a little notebook. She'd kept one in the army too, and she wrote down everything. Times, dates, what he said and who heard it. Not because she planned to use it, just because some part of her, the part that had survived 11 years by paying attention, knew that men like Halverson eventually overplayed their hand, and when he did, she wanted the record to be clean. 10 days in, something happened that none of the candidates were ready for. A storm rolled in during a night land nav exercise, the kind of Georgia thunderstorm that turns red clay into something between soup and glue. Halverson, against the advice of his own assistant instructor, sent the candidates out anyway. 4 of them got lost, 2 twisted ankles in the dark, and 1, a young candidate named Tyler, 22, on his first real outdoor course, didn't come back to the rally point. The assistant instructor wanted to wait for daylight. Halverson was on the radio, jaw clenched, suddenly aware that a missing candidate in a flooding creek system was the kind of thing that ended careers and triggered lawsuits. Danielle was already moving. She didn't ask permission. She grabbed a headlamp, a length of rope, and the candidate roster with Tyler's last known azimuth, and she went into the tree line in the rain. She found him 40 minutes later, up to his thighs in a flooded draw, 1 foot wedged under a submerged root, hypothermic and starting to panic. She talked him calm. She freed his foot. She got a rope around him and walked him out backward through chest-deep water, reading the current the way you read a current when you've done it for real, when getting it wrong means somebody drowns. She brought him into the staging tent, shaking and gray and very much alive. Halverson stood there in the lantern light. For 1 second, 1 single second, something human moved across his face. Then it was gone, and he did the thing that small men do. He said, "Candidates aren't authorized to leave the rally point without instructor approval. That's a safety violation, Foster." The tent went silent. Reyes, soaked to the bone, said quietly, "She just saved that kid's life." She broke. Protocol. Halverson didn't look at any of them. We'll note it. He turned and walked out into the rain. Tyler, wrapped in 3 blankets and still shivering, grabbed Danielle's sleeve as she turned to go. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. I really thought." "You're okay now," she said. "Go get warm." She walked back to her bunk in the dark and sat down and let her hands shake, finally, where nobody could see them. Then she stopped them. Then she went to sleep, because the next morning was coming, and she intended to be standing in front of the line when it did. You want to know what kind of person someone really is? Watch what they do when the right move and the safe move point in opposite directions, in the dark, with nobody applauding. Danielle didn't pull that kid out of the water because it would look good. There were no cameras. She did it because, somewhere a long time ago, she'd decided what kind of person she was going to be, and she'd never once renegotiated it. The morning after the storm, the assistant instructor, a quieter, retired soldier named Marcus Webb, pulled Danielle aside before the brief. Webb had been in Brackenridge 6 years. He'd watched a lot of candidates come and go, and he'd watched Halverson run his little kingdom for all of it. "That was the right call last night," Webb said quietly. "Going after Tyler, I want you to know somebody saw it for what it was." "Thank you." Webb hesitated. He glanced toward the office where Halverson was. "He's going to pull the stress eval on you this week, before the final field problem. I've seen him do it. He'll make it impossible, and he'll do it in front of everybody." He looked at her. "I can't stop him, but I keep the records. Every eval is scored on a rubric, and the rubrics get filed. If something ever looked off about a candidate's eval, the kind of thing a lawyer might ask about, he let it hang. I'm just saying, the paperwork's honest even when the man isn't." Danielle held his gaze and understood exactly what he was telling her. There was at least one person in this place who wasn't going to look away. "Appreciated, Sergeant Webb." Just Webb. He almost smiled, then he went back inside. The final field problem was 3 days out. Word had spread off the course the way it always does. Brackenridge ran an end-of-selection evaluation where outside observers came to watch the candidates run the culminating exercise, a long, scenario-based field problem in front of a panel. This year, the panel included a name that made Halverson sit up straighter when he read the email. Colonel Patricia Vance, retired, was coming to observe. Vance was a legend in a world that doesn't hand out legends easily. 26 years in service, much of it in roles that, like Danielle's, didn't make it into press releases. She now sat on the board that accredited training academies like Brackenridge. When she observed a course, that course's reputation wrote on it. Halverson had been trying to get her out to Brackenridge for years. She'd finally said yes. What Halverson didn't know, what nobody at Brackenridge knew, was that Patricia Vance and Danielle Foster had crossed paths once before, years earlier, in a place neither of them would name, during an operation neither of them would describe. Vance didn't know Danielle was a candidate here. Danielle didn't know Vance was coming. 2 people who had each, separately, decided the other was the real thing, about to end up in the same field in rural Georgia by pure accident. 2 days before the final problem, Halverson made his move. He waited until the afternoon, after a brutal morning ruck, when everyone was tired and Danielle had been up half the night on another barracks discipline inventory he'd assigned her. He gathered the candidates in the barn. He set his coffee down. He scanned the lines slow. Danielle saw the tell and went still inside. Foster, front and center. She stepped forward. "Time for your leadership stress evaluation," he smiled. "Now the rest of you watch close, because this is the kind of pressure the real world puts on you." He pulled a folded scenario card from his pocket and read it aloud. It was a combat lifesaver in command scenario, layered deliberately, a mass casualty situation with conflicting priorities, a degraded radio, a map of the deliberate error baked into the grid coordinates, and a 15-minute clock. He'd built it to be unwinnable. He'd built it so that whatever she chose, he could say she chose wrong. "You've got 15 minutes to brief your plan," he said, in front of everyone. No notes. He leaned against the wall and crossed his arms. "Try not to freeze up on us, Danielle." She looked at the card. She read it once. Then she did something he didn't expect. She set it down on the table and looked up at him. Master Sergeant, before I brief, the grid coordinate for the casualty collection point in this scenario doesn't exist. It puts the CCP in the middle of the river you've designated as the impassable hazard. As written, the scenario has no valid solution. Her voice was flat, professional, not a trace of attitude in it. I think you meant the Eastern Bank. If that's the intent, the plan proceeds like this. The barn went silent. Halverson's smile flickered. I didn't ask you to critique the scenario, Foster. I asked you to. With respect, Master Sergeant, a leader who briefs a plan around a known impossible objective gets people killed. The first job is to identify the bad assumption. I've identified it. Now I'll solve the corrected version. And she did. She briefed it cold. She triaged the casualties in the right order. She worked the degraded comms problem by establishing a runner relay before she did anything else, the move of someone who'd actually lost comms in a place where it mattered. She sequenced the evacuation by injury severity and route safety. She named contingencies. She did it in 11 minutes, no notes, in a voice so steady it was almost unsettling. And when she finished, she picked up the scenario card and set it back down on the table in front of Halverson and stepped back into the line. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Then Reyes started clapping. Then Cody. Then the whole barn. That stunned kind of applause, the kind people give when they've watched something they didn't think they were going to see. Halverson didn't clap. He stared at the table. His jaw worked. He was looking for the failure, scanning her plan in his head for the gap he could exploit. He found nothing. Because there was nothing. Noted, he said finally, the word coming out like it cost him something. Reset for afternoon drills. He turned away. But here's what I want you to see, because it matters. As he turned, his hands were shaking. Just slightly. The man who'd spent 9 years deciding who was strong enough had just watched someone be stronger than him in the one currency he understood, and some part of him knew it. What does a man like that do when the woman he tried to break refuses to break, and the most important observer of his career is about to walk onto his course in 48 hours? The morning of the final field problem, the Georgia sky was high and pale, and the air had that early cold that makes everything sharp. Folding chairs had been set up at the edge of the training area for the observers, the candidates. 9 left, 3 had washed out during the middle week, staged at the start point in full kit. Colonel Patricia Vance arrived in a plain rental car, alone in civilian clothes, with a leather portfolio under her arm. Halverson met her at the chairs, all warmth and deference, shaking her hand with both of his. Vance was polite and unreadable. She took her seat. She opened her portfolio. She scanned the candidate roster. And she stopped. She read one name twice. Then she looked up, slowly, across the field, at the line of candidates in their kit, and her eyes found Danielle Foster standing third from the left. Danielle felt the look land and met it. Neither of them changed expression. Neither of them said a word. But something passed between them across 40 yards of cold Georgia field, a recognition with no need for it to be spoken, and Patricia Vance settled back into her chair with the faint, private stillness of someone who has just realized she is about to watch something worth the drive. Halverson, oblivious, stood and addressed the observers. The final field problem was a 4-hour culminating scenario, a simulated downed aircraft recovery across 2 miles of mixed terrain, with injured casualties, a mock hostile element, time pressure, and a series of decision points designed to test leadership under fatigue. Candidates ran it in 2 rotating teams, with leadership rotating at each phase line. It was meant to be the hardest thing they'd done. Danielle's team drew her as leader for the final phase, the hardest one, the extraction under pressure, by design or by Halverson's hand. She couldn't tell and didn't care. For 3 hours, she watched and supported and led when it was her turn, and she did it cleanly. But it was the last phase where everyone saw it. The scenario threw a curveball Halverson had built to overwhelm. 2 casualties down at once, a collapsed route forcing a replan on the fly, and a communications blackout with the simulated higher command. The other team leader, a perfectly capable candidate, had frozen at the same decision point 20 minutes earlier, eaten the clock, and lost 2 simulated casualties. Danielle didn't freeze. She took a knee. She read the terrain. And then she did the thing that made Patricia Vance set down her pen. She abandoned the route everyone, including the scenario designer, assumed you had to take. She'd spent the whole course building a map in her head of this ground. Every game trail and drainage and saddle, the same instinct that had let her cut 18 minutes off the first day. She saw a path nobody else saw, a contour line that turned a collapsed primary route into a non-problem, and she committed to it instantly, reorganizing her team mid-movement, assigning the litter teams, talking them through it in a calm, low voice while the simulated chaos played out around them. She brought both casualties out, under time, through ground the scenario had assumed was impassable, exactly the way she'd once walked a half-drowned kid out of a flooded draw in the rain. When the exercise was called, her team came across the finish line ahead of the clock, with everyone accounted for, and for a second, the only sound was the wind in the pines. Then Colonel Patricia Vance stood up. She didn't clap, not at first. She just stood, looking at the field, and the act of her standing made everyone else go quiet. Then she set down her portfolio on the chair and she walked out across the field toward the finish point, and the observers turned to watch her go. And Halverson half rose from his seat, suddenly unsure what was happening on his own course. Vance stopped in front of Danielle, who had pulled off her helmet and was breathing hard, mud to her knees. "Foster," Vance said. "Colonel." "It's been a while." "It has, ma'am." Vance looked at her for a long moment, and then she did clap. One slow, deliberate clap, and then another. And then the whole field of candidates and observers joined in. And this time it wasn't stunned applause, it was the real thing. Loud and rolling. And Cody was grinning, and Reyes whooping, and Tyler, who was watching from the observer area because he'd been pulled from active candidacy after the storm. Tyler had his hands over his mouth. Vance turned and walked, unhurried, to where Halverson stood frozen by the chairs. "Master Sergeant Halverson." "Colonel, she performed well. I'll grant that, but there were protocol issues earlier in the course that I'll need to." "Roy." Vance's voice was quiet and it cut through everything. "Is the candidate's solution sound?" Halverson's mouth opened, closed. The whole field was watching. "The methods were unorthodox," he managed. "That wasn't my question. Is the solution sound? Did she bring both casualties out, within time, with her whole team intact, across that terrain?" A pause that lasted too long. "Yes," Halverson said. The word came out of him like a tooth being pulled. "The solution is sound." Vance nodded once. She turned to the observers and the candidates and pitched her voice to Carrie. "Then this panel confirms it. Candidate Foster passes selection, and for my part, I'll be noting her field problem as one of the cleanest culminating exercises I've observed at any accredited academy in 5 years." She let that land. Then, still in that carrying voice, she added, "Master Sergeant, I'll want the scored rubrics for every candidate evaluation run this cycle, including the individual stress evaluations, and the incident report from the storm exercise 10 nights ago. For the accreditation file, I'm sure everything's in order." Webb, standing off to the side, met Danielle's eyes for half a second. "The paperwork's honest, even when the man isn't." Halverson had gone the color of the gray Georgia sky. "Of course, Colonel." "Good." Vance turned back to Danielle and her voice dropped, warm now, just for her. "Walk with me a second, Foster." They walked along the tree line away from the chairs, the same trees she'd gone into in the storm. "I didn't know you were teaching," Danielle said. "I'm not. I sit on the board that decides whether places like this keep their accreditation." Vance glanced sideways at her. "I came out here as a favor, expecting to watch a competent course run by a man who likes the sound of his own voice. I didn't expect to watch you." She stopped walking. "What are you doing this for? You could write your own ticket anywhere. Why a certificate from Roy Halverson?" Danielle looked out at the field. "I wanted to teach, the young ones, the way somebody taught me before I knew I could be anything." She paused. "I figured if I could pass the hardest course around, nobody could ever say I didn't earn the right to stand in front of a classroom." Vance was quiet for a second. Then she reached into her portfolio and took out a card and handed it to her. I run a leadership and instructor development program for an organization you'd recognize if I said the name. We bring in people who've actually been there to train the next generation. The pay's better than this. The work matters more than this. She nodded at the card. When you're ready, no rush. Talk to your family first. Danielle looked at the card. Then she looked back at Vance. I'll think about it. Don't think too long. People like you don't come along often, and when they do, the worst thing the rest of us can do is make them wait in line. Vance almost smiled. It was good to see you, Foster. It really was. And she walked back toward the chairs, leaving Danielle standing at the tree line holding a card that had just quietly changed her life. Have you ever watched a man's whole story about himself come apart in real time on the very ground he thought he owned? That evening, after the observers had gone and the candidates were packing up, Danielle stepped away from the noise and called her mother. Yvonne picked up on the second ring. Tell me, baby. I passed, Mama. There was a sound on the other end, a breath that turned into something else. And then Yvonne Foster was crying, the way she'd never let Danielle see her cry in person. 400 miles away on a phone where it was safe. Of course you did, she said, when she could talk. Of course you did. I never had one single doubt. Not one. There's something else. Danielle looked down at the card in her hand. A colonel offered me a job. A real one. Teaching. A colonel. Yvonne said it slowly, tasting it. My daughter. Another breath. You remember what I said about that man? Outlast him? I remember. You didn't just outlast him, baby. You buried him without saying a single ugly word. That's the part that gets them. They want you angry so they can call you angry. You never gave him the satisfaction. She laughed, wet and proud. That's my girl. That's always been my girl. That's always been my girl. Danielle stood in the cooling Georgia, dark with a phone pressed to her ear, and for the first time in a long time she let herself feel all of it at once. A few hundred yards away, in the little office at the edge of the training area, Master Sergeant Roy Halverson sat alone under a single lamp. On the desk in front of him was the candidate file for Foster, Danielle. He'd written something on the first week evaluation, weeks ago, in his own hand. Candidate likely to struggle. Recommend managed expectations. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up a pen and drew a line through it, slow, and under it he wrote one word. Outstanding. He put the file in the box for Webb to process. He turned off the lamp. He sat in the dark for a while, and he did not tell anyone what he was thinking. Out at the edge of the field, Danielle hung up with her mother and stood looking at the tree line where she'd walked into the storm 10 nights before. Tyler found her there. He was holding his packed bag, leaving in the morning, and he stopped a few feet away like he wasn't sure he was allowed to. I just wanted to say it again, he said. Before everybody leaves, you saved my life, and then you ran the whole rest of this thing like it was nothing. He shook his head. I'm going to do this for real someday, the whole career, and I'm going to tell people there was this woman at my selection course who pulled me out of a river and then schooled everybody, and they're not going to believe me. Danielle smiled, a real one, the first easy one in 3 weeks. Then make them believe you, she said. Be that good. Danielle Foster didn't walk onto that course to prove anything to Roy Halverson. She'd stopped needing the approval of men like him a long time before she ever drove through the Brackenridge gate. She walked in to prove something to the girl she used to be, running 4 blocks in Gary just to feel her lungs burn. That the woman that girl became was real, that all of it counted, that nobody got to decide her limits but her. And when that field finally went quiet, it wasn't because the people watching were surprised that a woman could do it. It was because they were a little ashamed of how long it had taken them to expect it. If this one hit you somewhere, if you've ever been the one nobody bet on, leave a comment and tell me about it. Send it to somebody who needs it tonight, and subscribe because strength doesn't ask for permission, and neither should you. What stays with me about Danielle Foster isn't the final field problem. It's the quiet. 3 weeks of a man trying to wear her down, and she never once raised her voice to match his. I used to think strength was the thing that hits back hardest. Watching her, I started to understand It's the thing that refuses to be provoked into becoming smaller than it is. Roy Halverson built a trap out of everything he had: extra duties at 2 in the morning, an impossible scenario, a stress evaluation timed for the moment she'd be most exhausted, and every trap failed for the same reason. He kept aiming at her temper, and she didn't keep her temper there for him to find. Her mother, Yvonne, told her on a phone call from 400 miles away to outlast him instead of arguing with him, and that line carried Danielle through the whole thing. You can't break someone who's already decided they will simply still be standing when you run out of cruelty. But I don't want anyone to mistake patience for the only thing that saved her, because it wasn't. Patience without skill is just enduring. What made the difference was that she'd done the work. 11 years of it, real and uncelebrated. Long before Brackenridge ever existed, when she spotted the deliberate error in Halverson's scenario, that wasn't luck. That was a mind sharpened by people who needed her to be sharp to come home alive. The night she walked a half-drowned kid out of a flooded draw in the dark, that wasn't bravery alone. It was knowing exactly how a current moves and choosing to act anyway. Courage and competence aren't the same thing, and the people who change rooms have both. And underneath all of it was the part I keep circling back to. She went into the water for Tyler when there were no observers, no cameras, no advantage in it for her. Halverson called it a protocol violation. Webb saw it for what it was. The difference between those two men is the whole story, and it's the thing I'd want anyone watching to take home. Who you are when nobody's scoring you is who you actually are. So if you've ever been the person somebody decided wasn't enough before you open your mouth, hold these 3 things together, because no single one of them is sufficient on its own. Be good when it costs you and nobody's watching. Get so capable at your craft that excuses stop being available to the people who'd rather doubt you, and then outlast them. Not by arguing, but by simply continuing to stand, morning after morning, until the room finally catches up to what was always true. Danielle didn't beat Halverson by becoming like him. She beat him by being completely, unbreakably herself and letting the field do the talking. That's the part worth remembering.